The core of the HTML is the HTML tag. So it's pretty important to understand what HTML tag consists of and how to synthetically properly code up an HTML tag. Usually HTML tag have an opening and closing tag, and they surround some content. In this case, the tag P, which stands for a paragraph, is communicating to us that the content is in the white area should be treated as a paragraph. Now technically speaking, P by itself is called an element, and together with the angle bracket it's called a tag. But the truth is, in term is used to so interchangeably that whenever somebody refers to an element P or a tag P, they really could mean one and the same thing. Now, most HTML tags have a closing tag that matches its opening tag, but not all the tags. For example, the BR and HR tag. BR stands for line break and HR stands for horizontal rule. They only have an opening tag, they don't have a closing tag at all. Now, every HTML element can have predefined attributes. So, we will learn about the most common ones as we progress in the course. But here is what you need to know about tag attributes in general. Attribute is a name-value pair that is kind of a metadata about the element itself that it's being applied to. So in this example, we are assigning my ID as the value of the ID attribute. Each attribute has its own rules for the meaning of its value. So for example, ID attribute being assigned as an example has to be unique within the scope of the entire HTML document. In other words, no other elements of any kind in the web page is allowed to have its attribute equal to the string myId. If there is another element with the same value for ID, that would mean that the web page contains invalid HTML, which can potentially break some style, lingo, even functionality of the page. Now, let me go over some basic spacing rules. No space is allowed to exist between the opening bracket and the tag name. And likewise, space is not allowed between the opening bracket and the forward slash of the closing tag. However, you must have at least one space between the tag itself and any of its attribute. And space is allowed everywhere else and it's simply ignored. So, if you have an extra space after the P element in the opening tag, or if you have an extra space between the equal sign of the attribute name, value, or you have other spaces, even return characters, all of that is completely ignored by the browser. One more rule. Attributes can only be specified on the opening tag, so you can't specify an attribute on the closing tag. Now let's talk about the value of attributes for a minute. In HTML5, enclosing the value of the attribute in quotes is actually not required in all circumstances. But nevertheless, it's best practice to always surround the value of the attribute in either single or double quotes. It doesn't matter whether you're using single or double quotes. They really are equivalent in HTML. A more interesting case arises when the value of the attribute itself contains quotes. So the actual value has quotes as a part of its value. In this type of situation, the only thing you have to watch out for is making sure you close the quotes in the opposite order of the opening them. So, if the last quote was a single quote, it must be closed first. Which quotes you start with doesn't make any difference. You could start with double quotes as we have in the example here. Or you could start with a single quotes. You could also nest these as many times as you want as long as you close them. Obviously, in the proper order. But in practice, it's kind of very rare that you have to have more than 2 levels of quotes. Any more than that and your code just become messy as hard to read. Now, if you have dealt with previous versions of HTML, especially XHTML, you might be familiar with the idea of self-closing tag. Self-closing tag is basically an XML type of shorthand notation for a tag that happens to not to contain any content. For example, if we wanted to have a placeholder in our HTML document for some other content that we'll dynamically perhaps insert at some later point, that would be one of the example of when we need to have an HTML tag that has no content to begin with. However, in HTML5, the tag is a little bit more semantic. So if the HTML5 tag is capable, meaning it can possibly ever have some content. It is illegal for that tag to be self-closing even if there is no content at the moment. So instead you have to provide an opening tag and the closing tag without any space in between them to signify communicate the lack of content as surrounded by this tag. So in summary, we went over the anatomy of HTML tag, the opening and closing tags, and the fact that it can attributes describing what the tag itself is. Remember that you can use double and single quotes interchangeably. Just make sure if there is actual quotes in the value of an attribute, you have to interchange them in the same order that you opened them. You have to all close them in the opposite order. And we also went over how to specify a tag without any content inside HTML5, for which the rules are a little bit different than for the previous versions of HTML.